Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies, as well as Women's Studies department here at SDSU. I was born and raised in Soviet Tajikistan, a country that prior to the Soviet Union was a deeply conservative place that allowed limited opportunities for women. The Soviet regime, when it arrived, unveiled women, put them into places of work, things that allowed my own mother to experience possibilities that were unimaginable for her mother's generation. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of this essentially was gone. This experience serves as an important reminder to all of us about the fragility of progress for women. And I see so many parallels with Afghanistan and what's happening there today. I am thrilled to enjoy this terrific set of speakers and to have Huma Ghosh as our moderator. There's so much I can say about Huma. She's an emeritus professor, a mentor, a feminist, an expert in women in the Muslim world, including Afghanistan. She's a grandma, she's a good woman, and more. When I first came to SDSU, she welcomed me to SDSU, and we bonded over her stories about her visits to Kabul. And now to Huma.
Thank you so much for that, Zamira, bringing tears to my eyes. But I am Huma Ahmed-Ghosh. I'm, as Zamira said, a retired professor emerita from the Department of Women's Studies and the past director from the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies, the two programs that have made this event possible through funding, through support, through organization of this great event. And a big thank you to staff and to the panelists for sharing their invaluable insights in a few minutes, and to all the attendees for taking the time out to be here today. I cannot resist the urge to say, here we are again. 20 years ago, we had similar discussions. How do we build solidarity with women in Afghanistan? While my first instinct is to question why, a discussion on the same topic decades later, my heart sinks at the realization that maybe nothing ever changed in the past 2 decades in Afghanistan. In November 2001, the then First Lady Laura Bush claimed, Afghan women know what the rest of the world is discovering. The brutal oppression of women is the central goal of the terrorists, and therefore justifying US military intervention to liberate Afghan women. This statement, which justified and legitimized US occupation of Afghanistan, also resonates in strange ways today. One, the assumption that all terrorists are Muslim or Islamic, and two, that today in our own backyard in Texas and other states to follow, women's rights continue to be decimated. 20 years ago, we saw feminist, non-feminist writings, academia, and policymakers condemn the Taliban. Denial of human rights and specifically women's rights, etc., were condemned. And this raises another set of questions, for me at least. Where were we as feminists in the past 2 decades? As social activists, as policy informers, where were we? I myself have visited Afghanistan half a dozen times between 2003 and 13. And I am old enough to have been an adult when I visited Afghanistan for the first time in 1978 and 1979, before any of you were born. And so the return to Afghanistan was very interesting. It was a very, very different country. My quest was to gauge Afghan women's situation on the ground and look at how Afghan women strategize women's rights in an Islamic state. Each visit to Afghanistan, including a workshop I organized for Indian, Pakistani, and Afghan NGOs in New Delhi in 2005, was eye-opening. Being exposed to Afghan women's experiences in Afghanistan, seeing their dedication to human rights and women's rights, and balancing their faith, culture, and beliefs to sustain a society based on their terms, led to questioning my own Western elite academic and so-called liberal training and way of thinking. Today, we have three panelists who will enlighten us through their life stories, their research, their socio-political insights into the past, present, and future of Afghanistan, specifically keeping in mind women's status. Simultaneously, the panelists will deconstruct the homogenized narrative of the Afghan woman. I will address questions to all the panelists based on the specific interests and take it from there. We will respond to questions from the audience at the end of the conversation, but please feel free to send them in throughout the program. Just briefly, I would like to introduce our panelists. Safia Amiry, maybe a wave or something, I don't know, was born in Kabul, Afghanistan, where during the Taliban period, which was a continuation of the denial of women's fundamental rights, it started all off with the Mujahideen before them. She made, being born and growing up and studying in Afghanistan, made her more passionate about women's rights and gender equality. She has volunteered with many institutions in Afghanistan, working for women's rights and education. She's the founder of Movement for Change, where she and her team were working to promote education and women's empowerment. Safia is also the co-founder of Street Angels, an organization which supports Afghan street children in getting education. After completion of her BA degree in Afghanistan, Safia was awarded a Fulbright scholarship in 2017 for an MA in International Development Studies at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. Currently, Safia is a PhD student at McGill University in Montreal in educational studies with a focus on women and gender studies. Next, I want to introduce Aarozo Farhad. She was born and raised in Afghanistan too, moved to the United States in 2017. She has a background in political science and gender studies. She is particularly interested in gender politics. Currently, she works as the Afghan Placement and Resettlement Coordinator at Canopy NWA, a refugee resettlement agency in Northwest Arkansas. Last but not the least, Halima Zazem is an investigative journalist, filmmaker, and a lecturer in journalism and human rights at San Jose State University, California. Halima is currently a PhD candidate in feminist studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research is a feminist history of gender, empire, and resistance in Afghanistan and is informed by more than 20 years of working as a journalist, including a decade reporting on the war and rebuilding efforts in Afghanistan. Halima's articles have been published in the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, the San Francisco Chronicle, etc. From 2002 to 14, she trained more than 300 journalists in Afghanistan. She is the co-producer of a documentary, Front Runner, chronicling the campaign of the first female presidential candidate in Afghanistan. With those introductions, I'd like to jump in to a discussion now, and I will directly address Halima to start responding to the question that I'm going to put out, and then for Safia and Aarozo to add. Halima, you have unique experiences being born in Kabul, migrating to the US as a young child, and then returning to Afghanistan for many years, mainly, I think, under the Karzai regime. In the limited time we have, can you, through your experiences, historically elaborate on where the country is headed as a nation state, if we can refer to that as well, and what does it mean for Afghan women?
Thank you, Huma. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me and having me here. I'm honored to be on this panel, and for everyone who's joined. I think that before we get into where it's headed, I think it's important to take stock for what has happened in the last 20 years. I don't, I want to give credit for a lot that has occurred in 20 years, and primarily, and I will get to how that affects so many people and women now in Afghanistan. And I witnessed a lot of these events myself, as my co-panelists probably have too, being in Afghanistan, living there, reporting there, traveling there to various provinces, and seeing just the different waves and movements of women's rights and resistance. But one thing that I have to say is that women's resistance predates the last 20 years. It goes back decades, if not centuries. In my work, in my research, I look back at three empires, just three empires, but obviously very many before that, looking at the British, the Soviet, and the American empires. And we can see different forms of resistance that women have taken part in, initiated, and mobilized for in the various periods, taking different forms. Perhaps they're not the kinds of resistance that we would recognize from a Western or liberal, standpoint, but they are forms of resistance, whether they've been through poetry and song, through imagery. I've written quite a bit about the epic kind of heroine Malalai of Maiwand, who no one can claim actually existed, but what had her presence in the Second Anglo-Afghan War? What did it mean to the image of the Afghan woman resisting, of women in Pashtun culture, in nationalism, in Afghan culture, and Afghan culture? So resistance predates, obviously these last 20 years, but within these last 20 years, we've had very different categories of women mobilizing and resisting and advocating on very many different levels. One that I documented very closely was the campaign of the first woman who ran for president in Afghanistan, Dr. Masouda Jalal. I met her very early on at the Emergency Loy Jirga, the large Grand Assembly that first elected, and I will use that in quotations, President Karzai as the chairman of the administration at the time. And I was there on the ground when she emerged. People were very surprised that just a few months after the fall of the Taliban, that a woman would emerge and would have such leadership skills and be able to win, win so many votes and support. And then we saw her again emerge in 2004 as a candidate. I was on the ground during her campaign, the day of the elections, and she came very close to winning. There were a lot of election irregularities, but there was quite a bit of interest. And so I start with her is because I think Dr. Masouda Jalal really mobilized a very young category, a category of women to run for office. And I think we saw that as being very central to women's empowerment throughout the last 20 years. So many candidates, so many people, women in parliament. And I think that was a huge win. And then on top of that, the gains that we made through education, so many leading, so many girls leading their classes at high school, at elementary school. We had two superstar women last year on the college exams, reaching the highest level, young women of college exams. So these were the gains. These were the gains. And the reason I bring that up and I set it up is that today, when a category of women activists who have fled the country, they've had to flee, and because their lives were at risk, they groomed, whether knowingly or not, consciously or not, a second category and a third category who are rising now to run the protests. I'm in touch with a group of women from Herat. I did some reporting for Human Rights Watch 2 weeks ago, and we put that out. And they are rising to become the women's rights activists. Now their conditions are very different from the last 20 years, and we are working with that. But what I'm trying to show is a progression in the last 20 years and what that progression has led to in the current state.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the background is very, very important. And we will now move to Aarozo and continue with the question of what is happening now after the takeover of the Taliban and the evacuation of US ground troops. So what do you wish people in the US knew about the NATO intervention that isn't getting talked about?
Hello, everybody. It's a privilege to be here. And thank you, Halima, for all the background. Well, what most people don't know, and it doesn't get talked about, is how intervention in the first place happened, or again, all the interventions. So it's all usually, as an Afghan, I get this question that, you know what, you Afghans are allowing everybody to come to your country, invade it, mess up with your local politics, and then you're doing nothing. Well, that is not true. We never had the choice to choose who would come and invade us. So that is what it doesn't, well, who, first of all, who chooses somebody else to come and invade them? Nobody does. And it has historically not been true for Afghans as well. So that is one of the things which I personally get offended. Sorry to say this, but yeah, that's true. I get offended when people say, you Afghans allow everybody to come invade you. No, that's not true. You superpowers, whoever you are, be it the British and then the Russians, or now the Americans, which is NATO, and everybody else, they came, not that we invited them, but they just wanted to come. Well, first of all, if you were to, very, very bluntly speaking, if you were to invade, or if you were to fight the Taliban, then why would you not go fight in Pakistan, where there are billions of resources, saying that all the terrorist groups are being trained in there? So if you're simply trying to heal the branches of a tree, but you are not treating the roots. It doesn't work that way. How long will it take for you to just treat the branches and not go into the roots? So if you were to help Afghans through any power, be it NATO, ISAF, then please go and do a little bit more of research, and then or at least believe your own researches, which show that, you know what, Waziristan is there. You have to go there, not go to Afghanistan. It doesn't lead you anywhere. And then that has been proven by now. Everybody acknowledges it. So the Afghans have never had the choice to choose who they want to come to their country and invade. And that if anybody, and a lot of people believe that that is true, Afghans invited the Americans. No, that's not true. We never invited them. And again, if you're leaving, when did we agree on leaving the country? We never wanted you to stay there forever and, be whoever you are to decide for us, but we never decided that you just leave overnight. And then I just wish it didn't happen. And I really wish, as I'm very happy to talk today, but I don't wish for this talk to happen. I never wished for this, that we would come after 20 years and talk where we were 20 years ago. And where I was in first grade when the Taliban took over. And then today, my nephew is in the same situation. He might go to school or he might not. So we never invited them. So if anybody has a question that, no, you invited the NATO, the United States, or anybody, no, we didn't. And we never wanted them. So please, that is a question. And really, it's a right for me as an Afghan to say that we never invited you. But thank you for coming. And now I don't know. No, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, that message was loud and clear. And you're very right, because if you go all the way back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, we see that the British started it all and did not succeed. And then the Russians and then the Americans, and nobody really has come out ahead, except that, of course, Afghanistan as a country, as a nation, has paid the price for all these invasions. I would like to now, Safia to also comment on the same question and elaborate also on the education part that Halima also pointed out, that how that severely impacts the state as well as gender issues.
Thank you, Huma. I'm honored to be here today, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Yes, it's actually it's a difficult conversation to talk about, but at the same time, it's important. This dialogue needs to happen, and it's the right time for this to happen. It's unfortunate that we are talking about this again, but here we are, so we need to talk about it. Adding back to what Aarozo mentioned earlier. So let's go back to the intervention or US intervention 20 years ago. Thank you, Huma, for bringing the speech from Laura Bush in the beginning. It was right, I think the right time to talk about this. They said that we are going to Afghanistan to fight terrorism and save Afghan women. Save, they used the word saving Afghan women. So what happened today? Are Afghan women saved? And did we actually fight terrorists? So this is a question I'm asking as an Afghan who was affected directly by the regime. I was a kid when they came in the first place, and as a woman, I lost my privileges to even like get education, my basic human rights. So yeah, going there, and then like discussing about a little bit about here today, that what happened with like and how Taliban took over overnight. So who legitimized Taliban after 20 years? They were not a group that were being recognized. US went and signed a peace deal with them. They give them political power. So now that we are discussing that what went wrong, that was wrong. That was wrong to legitimize a terrorist group and say, hey, you have a political say, come and talk to me. And then leaving, yes, definitely, we were not expecting US to stay forever, but they should have stayed long enough to make sure that peaceful transition was happening. We managed to accomplish a lot the past 20 years, and we lost it overnight. It's not easy. We gained a lot when it comes to women's rights. We had women's ministers, ambassadors, judges, doctors, pilots, professors, and many, many, many more. Women at least got their basic human rights. Women managed to get the certain laws and policies approved. But where we are right now, why we are having this discussion again, we achieved to have a ministry for women's affairs, and now it's changed to the Voice and Virtue. The same ministry which is now working against women in Afghanistan, the same ministry which is denying women's education. They opened schools for boys, but they denied women to go to school. They are talking about a segregated education, which is still not, even that's not happening. And also they are talking about that, oh, we let women to go to school, we let women to go to work, but we just need to prepare the environment or to just have everything ready for them. We had the same talk 20 years ago. They exactly did the same thing. And we saw what happened during that 5-6 years. So this is happening again, exactly the same way. It is happening today. And it's so unfortunate that it's less than 2 months from the Taliban take over, and you hardly even hear people talking about Afghanistan. We are here today, this mess happened again, and the world let Afghanistan down one more time after 20 years of working hard to achieve something. And for me as a woman, a little bit going back to the education part, yes, we were promised last time too that you will get the rights to education, but it didn't happen. For me as a woman, I was denied education. My parents risked their lives to send me to school because education is important to us Afghans, for our women too. My parents sent me to underground school. I was passing a Taliban checkpoint every single day, hiding my books under that big scarf that I was not even able to wear it myself, and my mom was supposed to wrap me in that big scarf. And the minute they knew that I was holding books and I'm going somewhere to get education, Or even if they knew that one of those books was an English book, me and my family was killed right away. But that's the price we paid. Like, we risked our lives to make sure we get education, to make sure we are working toward the progress. And then during the past 20 years, we worked hard again and we lost again overnight. So yes, it is the time to have this talk, but it's unfortunate to have this talk.
Huma, can I just add one thing to that, please?
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to point out that in our history, which has been framed masculine, and in our history that has been run completely up until the last 20 years, for the most part, by men, we have invited foreign countries and powers. Our history does say that in the 1800s, when we had Shah Shuja, one of our leaders, and he was forced into exile. He was brought back in by the help of the British. Same with Abdurrahman Khan, Habibullah Khan. I studied these specific leaders under these various time periods in Afghanistan, and time again, because of Afghanistan's own lack of budgets and finances, foreign powers were invited in. So at various times, we did invite foreign powers. Same with the Soviet period.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. And I also just want to say a few sentences about the homogenizing, because I was being interviewed by a news agency a few weeks ago, and I pulled out my articles that were published 18 and 15 years ago. And when I started reading them, it could have been written yesterday. I got goosebumps. I said, nothing has changed. But you're very right, Halima, that there were internal politics. There was internal politics, but there's also been a great rural-urban divide. And I wrote about that decades ago, is that even today, in Afghanistan, the story in Kabul is very different from the story in rural Afghanistan. And there was definitely some celebration of the Taliban being back, because in rural Afghanistan, not much had changed, and that has been the story always. So, I think if any of you want to talk about the distinctions also and the hierarchies, because there is a sense in the West and other parts of the world that there's one homogeneous Afghanistan without keeping the tribal affiliations also in mind, who are frankly affiliated to foreign powers, and also the gender impact and the diversity of Afghanistan, and how that is impacted, and how the Taliban responds to that. Yeah. Would one of you want to respond to that? Or?
So I just wanted to point out the rural-urban divide that has existed, that is definitely there. And I think there was a New Yorker piece by Anand Gopal a couple of weeks ago that was a very beautifully written descriptive piece, but I think in the end, maybe some of the panel, some participants have read it, that really made the case that tried to make the case that rural women are currently content and happy because their homes are not being bombed, they are in relative peace. But I found that the article and sometimes these arguments very short-sighted, because we're exchanging one form of violence for another form of violence. As the Taliban now claim that the rural areas are calm, and therefore women in the rural areas are safer. Women are imprisoned in their homes in a different way than in the past, but still, like I said, we've exchanged one kind of violence for another. And the other thing that I'm researching right now, as I do more research for another report that I'm working on with Human Rights Watch, is the economic hardships, the food scarcity, the lack of access for markets. These are all forms of violence that will affect lives and lives of women and children. So the argument that it is more peaceful in the provinces and in the rural areas, I think it's short-sighted.
Thank you for that clarification. Let's continue with shifting the topic a little bit. I want to ask each one of you, what does solidarity look like? And this is given the global feminist movements or transnational feminism or whatever terms we may want to use, which are ultimately more academic, because, you know, for me, reality was very different when I visited. But today, what we always have to start again. And today, what would global solidarity look like? I want you guys to comment on that and then take it further to how can people in the US and Canada act in support of women in Afghanistan, and, you know, the role of the Afghan diaspora. So sort of a three-part question, but, you know, we can start with Aarozo and go to Safia and come back to Halima. Yeah.
It's a good question. When I was reading it, when it was first sent to me, I thought for a second, and for now, it's very honestly, it doesn't mean a lot to me. Because if there was solidarity, we wouldn't reach this point today. We should have had the solidarity for the last 20 years, so we wouldn't have this result that we are talking about being 20 years back. But again, on the positive side, there are a lot of women who are talking about Afghan women, and there are a lot of people who are ignoring it. So, but let's say those in support, what you could do as citizens of any other country or in the diaspora, use any platform, anything available, reach out to your representatives in any political institution to be supportive of women's rights in Afghanistan for now, and especially education. We know that millions of girls now do not go to school, only to 6th grade. That's also not very, it's not insured for every child girl in Afghanistan, and higher education is still at risk. So there are some institutions which are open, but they're not fully functional. And there are some very controversial things going on, and nobody really talks about it seriously. That is a big, big concern to me, and I believe to everybody in this room. So that is what you could do as somebody who wants to be in solidarity with women. With the diaspora, they have played a huge role as of now. Even I talk to a lot of people, and they not only support women financially, but also they are trying, for instance, to have online classes, which I don't know how much impact they could have, but at least for because access to internet is a big deal in Afghanistan and even in Kabul. But still, there are bits and pieces you could just put together and help women. In general, if we talk about the feminist solidarity, that is a little complicated to me, because I haven't gotten to a conclusion that there is kind of solidarity between feminists of the East and the West, that there has always been this divide. So I cannot comment on that particular part, that how could that divide be, united at this point of the history. And I think it will take a lot more time to work on that. And I'm not even sure if that will ever exist, the solidarity between, let's say, white feminism and intersectional feminism. So that is just something I need to explore.
Thank you. Thank you. Very well said. Very well said. Safia, you want to?
Yeah, sure.
That?
Yeah, definitely. I will start with education. As Aarozo mentioned, that there's a lot of people. I'm not only talking about girls' education, which is of course very important, but I'm also talking about the quality of education and education for all. Our boys are also not receiving the right education because a lot of women teachers are laid off. We don't have those teachers in the school to teach them. So that's why the first thing I'm calling the world, everyone who has access, who can provide, to now we have, like, through COVID, we learned that there are mediums through which education be provided, even if it's not in person. We can use those mediums to provide education for Afghan kids. Let's not leave Afghan kids alone. Let's not deprive them of their basic human rights, which is education. I call on universities, on schools abroad to give free classes for Afghan students to make sure they are not deprived of their right to education. Again, I'm calling, we are discussing about feminism and feminists, the way feminist agenda was politicized 20 years ago. I'm calling on feminists that you have the power to push policies. you have the power to push your governments to not let Afghanistan alone today, because Afghanistan issue is not only an issue in Afghanistan, it's a world issue. If we said in the first place that we are going to fight terrorism and saving Afghan women are not saved, Afghan women are still in trouble, and also we are still enabling a nest for terrorism again. So if that's the case, let's push that agenda forward to make sure that now feminists are pushing those political agendas to make sure Afghan women are not left alone in these critical moments. Also, the other issue would be about, or the other point would go to media or people in general. Let's start raising awareness about the situation, because a lot of media agencies are denied to cover stories, or people are scared of talking to media in the ground. So let's find a way to make sure the story is running. People know what is happening on the ground. So a lot of, especially international media, is not aware of the situation on the ground. So let's make sure the narrative is going and the right narrative is running. I'm calling on Human Rights Watch to make sure those violence are being recorded. It's important now more than ever. Let's make sure that we have personnel on the ground, or in whatever way possible, that those atrocities are not being forgotten. International community can provide aid to Afghanistan, because right now people are selling their home or household stuffs to make sure that they are not starved. So Afghanistan was a country run by aid. Like they were living in a situation where like they could not survive without aid. We have a winter coming. So to make sure we are helping Afghans, we should not stop aid. The aid should still continue going to Afghan people. I'm calling on scholars to make sure this dialogue is running. Like today that we are sitting here and discussing this issue, let's keep this dialogue running. Scholars can write about this. Scholars can start this dialogue to keep going. So again, I'm saying that let's not forget Afghanistan, because Afghanistan issue is not just only Afghan issue, but it's a world issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was extremely well explained, because I think everybody wants to condemn the Taliban in a non-historical and non-political way and talk about just women's issues. But I'm glad that you brought up the issue of foreign aid, because it's the average Afghan that really is suffering ultimately. You know, those in power are always very comfortable, and one needs to relook these kinds of economic policies. And also, I think you're very, very right in saying that feminists in different countries need to confront their own governments. I mean, when it comes to waging war, why aren't we consulting feminists? Why is it that women and feminists are usually called upon to talk only about women's issues? And, you know, why is it that we are not called upon to ask which organization or political party should come into power? And so if the US has brought the Taliban into power, then really it makes talking about women's issues really redundant, because everybody knew what was going on under Taliban. So, you know, I'll now pass it on to Halima to add to the discussion and enlighten.
Sure. I draw from both Aarozo and Safia's comments, and I agree. And I think that modern Afghan history in some ways is a history of white liberal feminism in the West. And the ways in which it has been mobilized to justify military action. I think that's important to consider. And as we think of solidarity, and as I take Safia's point of calling on scholars, I think about how Afghan women have developed and embody a divergent form of feminism that includes new definitions and articulations of what resistance and advocacy can be. And I think that that's where, also drawing from Aarozo's point of how do we reconcile this kind of Western and transnational feminism? How do we reconcile this here and learn from this, from these areas? I'm drawn to the work of, and many of you in feminist studies, gender studies would know, Palestinian American anthropologist Laila Abu Lughad. I'm drawn to her work and adapting it in the Afghan context. And I work through how might I develop theories that give Afghan women credit, or scholarship that might give Afghan women credit for resisting in a variety of creative ways the power of those who control so much of their lives. We have to reframe how we think of feminist resistance in that way, and without misattributing to them forms of consciousness or politics that are not part of their experiences. Something like a feminist consciousness or feminist politics, or devaluing their practices as pre-political, primitive, or even misguided. Second, how we might account for the fact that Afghan women both resist and support the existing systems of power, that feminism and feminist resistance can lie perhaps in a space between these, that we may not recognize in kind of Western liberal feminism. So how might we account for the fact that both women both resist and support the existing system of power, like through practices of veiling or wearing the burqa, without resorting to analytical concepts such as false consciousness, which dismiss their own understanding of their situation. So I take on that challenge that now, post American period, I guess we can probably call it now, post-American occupation, invasion, we grapple with how we look at feminism in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, because you're right, as scholars, this time at least in the West, we cannot abandon Afghan women. And I had a conversation with all three of you previously to know, where all of us are located. And I think my conversation with Aarozo a few days ago, she brought up a very interesting point. She said, it's not about solidarity anymore, it's about empathizing. And that really struck a note with me, is that how can we empathize instead of sympathizing and talking about solidarity and sending money, or what can we do, is really, really understand the diversity of Afghan women and their issues. And also, what does the Taliban mean? What does Islam mean? Let's not conflate all of those things, and try and create what you're saying, Halima, is just a kind of transnational feminism that is more empathetic to women and women's lives in Afghanistan, rather than imposed from outside. To the three of you, and either anyone of you can jump in, is, and this is going to increase maybe more, now that at least, and I like to say it in a little more political manner, we are temporarily engaged with Afghanistan. I don't know how long this will last, but have you encountered assumptions people may have made about you in North America and in US and Canada as Afghan women? And which assumptions would you correct or speak back to? And the third part is, how have your experiences in the US and Canada informed your understanding of the invasion? Do one of you? Okay, Aarozo, let's go with you.
Maybe go ahead, sure. This is a very interesting question, because I think I and Safia quite recently, well, not very recently, but 2017 is still recent, so we just moved here. And it was interesting to know for me that people, I'm speaking generally, not specific people I knew, but they thought, how could I speak so fluent English? I'm like, because I learned it. And so the first thing here, which was sort of a culture shock to me, that people thought you could learn English only if you lived in one of the English speaking countries, which is not true. My English was the way it is back 4 years ago. And I just acquired it. It's a skill, but that kind of, I felt that it determines who you are, if you spoke better English or not. And then as a Muslim woman, it's generally that, okay, so you are a Muslim and where is your scarf? I was like, there is that distinction between culture and religion is something which stuck with me, that, okay, if you are a Muslim, then it automatically, there's a connotation that you should be wearing the scarf, and being a Muslim means wearing a scarf. So that I didn't really know. I honestly didn't know that before. I'm like, okay, I wouldn't be asked this question. And then it's that, how are you open-minded? This is one of the questions I always get. I always struggle between explaining being an Afghan and then being a Muslim. I still don't know what people expect me to answer about being open-minded as a Muslim Afghan woman, and especially that I'm able to speak some good level of English, which is understandable to a lot of people. So that I personally, I haven't come with answers which are very satisfying for myself. It's very difficult to answer that you could be a Muslim and you could not wear scarf, and you could at the same time learn to speak good English, and at the same time you can just be open-minded, you know. You could just wear shorts perhaps, if that is how you define open-minded. But then again, when it comes to open-mindedness of Muslim women, it doesn't have to do anything with their scarf. I have very strong feminist women in my life who are fully with hijab, and their hijab has nothing to do with their identity as a woman or as a Muslim. They just choose to do that. And they do not see that as a sign of suppression, oppression, which is usually in the context of white feminism, that, okay, wearing a scarf means you are oppressed. Wearing a scarf means you did not choose it. It means somebody did for you. No, that is not true. We could just look, and then at some cases, maybe Halima or you would elaborate more on that. In the Iranian case, when the revolution happened, a lot of women went underground because they were not able to wear scarves, or they have those different kind of veils in Iran, and that was suppression to me. So I see it both ways. Well, now you are not allowing people to, let's say, wear hijab or whatever in France. That is what the Taliban are doing in Afghanistan, making women wear scarves, and they're not allowing it. So to me, these are two sides of one coin. I don't see any difference between the two regimes as being a very secular, so to say, regime in France, and then a very fanatic Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan. I think I'm just speaking from here and there, but I'll just stop here. And if I had to add something, I'll hop in again.
Okay, sure, definitely. So to Safia, basically, you have lived in the US and in Canada now. And so basically trying to figure out what are the stereotypes you may have encountered that people have of Afghan women, and which are the assumptions that you may want to clarify or, respond to. And, especially in more recent times, yeah.
Yes, definitely. Aarozo mentioned a lot of the points that for me in the beginning of my journey, especially in the US, I came across those a lot, that being an Afghan woman and a Muslim woman, you are not having a headscarf or speaking English, or being as a woman, like you're alone here in a foreign country doing your master's, or even being a woman, a Muslim woman, an Afghan woman doing a master's degree itself was quite a surprise for a lot of people. But at the same time, when we were talking about Afghanistan, that made me to have some workshops in my previous school, like at Ohio University, where to talk about Afghanistan and where is Afghanistan, what Afghanistan is. The first thing I was hearing, they were thinking it's a country in the Middle East, where yes, women are pretty much covering. They are oppressed by men. There's no electricity, there is not tall buildings, and basically nothing in a corner of the world. Some people might not even know what was that, but I think we got a little bit popular with 9/11, so people at least knew the name. The other part was, yeah, definitely what Aarozo mentioned. But my experiences in the US and now Canada is also going back to what I experienced as a woman in Afghanistan. So I got the opportunity to study women and gender studies academically. I was active in Afghanistan working for women's rights education, and advocating for women's rights. But it was great to be part of this academically, and that kind of made me reflect back on my journey, that why I chose my PhD or like chose to get academically involved with specifically education and gender studies, because for me as a woman, like education had such a value in my family as an Afghan woman. And as I mentioned earlier, that how my family risked their lives for me, I was a kid, like I was 6 years old or 7 years old. I even didn't know what that means, like what Taliban means, or what like hiding my books under that big scarf meant. So for me, I was going to school and I was happy about it. But for them, they knew what they're risking for sending me to those schools. So that kind of shaped my journey of where I am today, and again, what I'm willing to do for my country and moving forward for Afghan women.
Thank you so much, so much. It's very encouraging to hear this, and we will now move to Halima to tell us about her experiences.
So my experience has been a bit different in the fact that I'm a bit older. I think the war, meaning this last kind of 40 plus years of war, so is as old as I am. The 78 coup occurred when I was 6 months old, and so I always kind of think of my lifetime in this continuum of war in Afghanistan. But I came to the United States in 1980, very early on. And so the assumptions I've encountered in the US, and you said North America as well, have changed over time. As a child, as an Afghan refugee child, very early on, I think there was quite a welcoming feeling when we first arrived in the 80s. There was a very small Afghan community, if any. We didn't have the resources that the Afghan communities have now. We didn't have the mosques, the butchers, the bakers, the Afghan restaurants, none of that. That was all built through when I was growing up. And so the assumptions were different. People were very welcoming because the politics were different, because of the way the United States framed the assistance to the Mujahideen, and felt and rallied support by US audiences for their efforts in sending money and fighting the Cold War via proxy through Afghanistan. And so that affected how I was received. Everyone was always very welcoming. I grew up going to protests in San Francisco and different places, sitting on my father's shoulders, chanting "Free Afghanistan, Free Afghanistan." And it's interesting that I see those hashtags and those slogans out now again, 40-something years later. And so I remember I frame it in that early childhood, but then also I was in New York City. I was going to grad school on the day 9/11 occurred. So I was there very shortly after. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the invasion of the Operation Enduring Freedom, where the Americans started the bombing campaign in operation. So I was there in New York City. I lived through that, and very quickly knowing that Afghanistan was where Al-Qaeda was based, and that was where the attention was going. Feeling those pains of identifying as Afghan in 9/11 in New York City, while feeling the pain as an American, also going through that. All these years were the 20-year, the longest war the United States has had. a lot of people I come across, whether they're students or faculty, or a lot of people have had a family member or someone they know serve in the war, possibly die in Afghanistan. So then the assumptions are different. So I've seen this change in assumptions about Afghan women, and I felt those reactions over time. Some have been good very early on, then very difficult, and then very kind of somber as the war was winding down.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I want to also, bring you guys in to suggest resources, because we have a large audience and we're starting all over again, hopefully with deeper sense of feminist intervention in what's happening now and what might happen in the future. So first, I'd like to ask you, how do you keep up with what is happening on the ground? I mean, I'm sure you have your own sources, so do enlighten us. And are there any resources you would recommend for people to get information if they're not Afghans and do not have contacts in Afghanistan? So could you guys suggest something, and also let us know how you're getting your information without, of course, risking anybody's lives in the process? Yeah.
Sure, I can start with that. I mean, my main network is obviously the hundreds of journalists that I've trained over the years. The journalists in Afghanistan, students are very loyal to their teachers, and we take pride in that. And as you know, I don't want to over kind of state it, but my people I trained were so happy that they've kept and they've stayed. They went from student to friend and colleague. And so this wide network of people who I've trained, I've kept in touch with their families. I've also, kept in touch with a lot of sources. And so every day through WhatsApp, I'm getting a lot of messages, things that I can put out publicly. I reach out individually with people. That's one of the best ways to find out what's happening and on the ground. I don't always rely solely on social media or Twitter, because there's a lot of propaganda and retweeting of unconfirmed information, which I worry, because as Aarozo and Safia have mentioned, there's a lot of dark spaces in Afghanistan not being covered, meaning dark spaces, meaning not being covered by media. A lot of our good journalists are out, and a lot of our good journalists are rightfully afraid to report because of their own lives. So there's a lot in the dark. And so I always recommend that. However, there are people on social media Afghans who are in Afghanistan, who are still tweeting, who are still sharing information. And there are people in the diaspora who are doing kind of similar to what we're doing, what I'm doing, being in touch with individuals on the ground and then reporting some of it. I retweet a lot of these people, so people can follow me on Twitter if they like, and they can see who I follow. And I can, because I retweet a lot, I do a combination of diaspora, but also a lot of sources on the ground. So my Twitter handle is just my name, Halima Zazem. But that's how I stay informed. Combination. You can't just rely on what's being reported, and you can't just rely on what's being reported on by Western media, because as I've analyzed the headlines, there seems to be quite agenda setting and intentional kind of coverage of certain angles, even by some of our leading news organizations like the Washington Post or the New York Times. I have not been happy with some of that coverage, because what is not covered only emphasizes what is covered, and what is not being shed light on is really in the dark.
Thank you so much. That's extremely useful. So your Twitter thing is Halima Zazem. Yeah. And
yes,
I think
I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, put it in the chat so everybody can get to see it. Yeah. Thank you so much. Aarozo, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. It's mainly, as Halima mentioned, it's mainly for me very personal connections, because my family lives in Afghanistan still, my parents, my siblings. Yeah. My father works with an NGO. Fortunately, he still works and he travels. So and then he works in the security sector of the NGO. I will not name the NGO. So I get a lot of confirmed information, which comes through a lot of filter. Because it's an international NGO, very reputable. I still will not name it though. But again, and one thing I would be very clear, please do not follow the internal news channels. Tulu News used to be a good source. For now, we all know that there is a lot of political pressure on all of them, literally every platform. So you will just listen to a lot of things, even about women's shoes, you know, the choice of not wearing heels from Tulu News and the Taliban speaking about it. Well, if you want to stay informed about what the Taliban are doing, maybe you could just get bits and pieces from them, but that is not the source of information. I have some noise outside, so I'll
That's okay. That's perfectly fine. Continue.
One of the resources I think which I found a little bit useful is the Amnesty International. They put some news out there. They are also under a lot of pressure. I know they cannot do a lot of things, but at least what they put there is close to what we want to hear about. But again, you have to know that there is a lot more going on which is not being covered. A lot of people are being abducted, a lot of people are being killed based on ethnic lines, and then some political connections, being allies with organizations associated with the West, and then being media people. So there are a lot of people who are disappearing overnight, though the Taliban have publicly announced that they will not do anything to anybody. That is not true. That is not true. That is not true. So that is very, very sad. At the same time, sometimes I don't know how to feel about it. Very honestly, I have all these mixture of feelings, which are anger, happy, sad, I don't know, and all the feelings together. So social media helps, but it does not, because of a lot of people. Again, I would emphasize that a lot of people, including women, unfortunately, are trying to tell us to give the Taliban a chance. I don't know what chance, like chance for what? Like chance for, again, determining that you cannot wear perfume outside, you cannot wear dark colors because you would just, I don't know, do something to the men's sentiments and things because they're too weak to control themselves. Fine, but what else? Like a chance to do what? So those are being said in the Afghan media. So the Afghan media in general is not something to rely on, though there is a new channel, Afghanistan International. They're not doing very good job because they are very new, and but they are trying to do that. It's based in the United States, so not that I trust them a lot, but at least they're outside of the country and a little bit more less under the control of the political regime in the country. Those are some of the resources you could just look. And Al Jazeera sometimes does something, but then Al Jazeera is, again, you have to be very careful about what they do. So locally, I don't recommend any resources. But again, one more thing is very important, which Halima also emphasized. If you know Afghans, please listen to their personal stories. All of them have a lot of personal stories. They might seem exaggerated to you, but no, that is not exaggerated. If somebody is telling you that they're not allowed to get out of their houses and go get grocery, that is true. It is happening there. And it is happening not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas. It's like it's the whole country suffering from this trauma. And then there's a lot of course, traumatic experiences for everybody. And those, if you have Afghan friends, please talk to them if you want to get a little bit of personal stories. If not, find some Afghan friends, maybe make some Afghan friends, get educated about it. This is an issue where, first of all, everyone listening to us has the responsibility to get some kind of awareness about the situation. It's way serious than what the media is telling us. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really good point you said, because everybody in the audience and others in the country may not have Afghan friends or know how to contact Afghans, but every city almost now has refugee organizations. And that's one way of finding out where are the refugee organizations in your city and what kind of support are they looking for. And when you go there, you will meet Afghans, you'll meet many others, and you will meet Afghans. Google, like for San Diego, I would just Google, Afghan Association of San Diego, and you will come up with stuff. So there are ways and means of meeting people from the country, those who are brought up here, who can inform you about what is really going on, and then how to show solidarity on their terms and what their needs are on their terms. So, thank you so much, Aarozo, for bringing that up. And now, Safia, what are your sources and resources?
The points were pretty much covered, and also thank you for pointing out, Huma, to say that let's show solidarity in their terms, because it's like, if you are not in the situation, you don't know what a person is going through. So to be helpful, to support them, ask them questions, ask them what they feel. They might not even know sometimes what they feel, but they might share where they are standing or what's happening. And also, yes, for getting the news and information, there is not a lot of reliable sources at the moment, given what's happening in the country and how media outlets are under pressure, political pressure. And also there's, as you mentioned, a lot of agenda setting, and Halima, I think, pointed out too, that there's a lot of agenda setting in the international media, headlines right now. So I won't trust much what is being published there too. But Aarozo already pointed out the point about Amnesty and Afghanistan International, which they're the two that I'm also, they're pretty close to some of the stories that's happening back in the country. For me personally, I still have families in the country, so I get my information to my families and friends who are still stuck there. And yes, so I'm not pretty much, I'm not too active on Twitter, but sometimes I do post on my Instagram. My Instagram is public, it's under my name, Safia Amiry. So sometimes I post stories, I don't post a post. So you might not see lots of history there, because I want it to be a news and go away for different reasons. One can be also the security and safety. So yeah, we are trying to at least, like, people here and some of my friends that I repost from them too, they are the people that who know people or have families on the ground, that they can verify those stories or the narratives that they're posting. And as you mentioned, there are lots of refugee organizations in different cities in different parts of the world. So that can be another source of information where you can get the first-hand information from Afghans themselves, because it's hard right now to get the right narrative from media agencies.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that should be very useful. But before we open it up to the audience, I would like to get a few comments from you. I mean, the Taliban is there. The Taliban has formed a government. I mean, we cannot deny some of that. And also the Taliban is raking in some global partners. Like you said, it's different. The international community wants to use words like insurgency or insurgents instead of terrorists, given that the US had made such a strong statement about never negotiating with terrorists. Now we are seeing a shift in language, but it's the same people they brought in 96. It's a bad marriage, love and hate. We bring them in twice, yeah? And then we change the language to suit our convenience. And of course, we all are aware that there are countries that are trying to recognize Taliban as a legitimate government have big business interests in Afghanistan. So at some level, do you think that the Taliban is the only alternative just now as a government? Yes or no? And if it is yes, then we are aware of what they did previously and what they will do now, also in terms of women's issues. But how would you re-envision or re-strategize the demand for human rights and women's rights within this framework of a Talibanized Islam?
I can start with that. And I think for the first part of your question, I'd like to bring up, and I've raised this in other speaking events that I've been part of, is that one thing that hasn't been brought up is that, and not enough, it hasn't been brought up at all. I haven't seen it in any of the coverage, is that this was not a takeover or an insurgency per se. This was a soft coup.
Yes.
One allowed by the US military and the international community. I really think that needs to settle into our consciousness here. This was a soft coup. This was something the Taliban were groomed and allowed in to take over. And the US and the US government is responsible for that. So it's being called as a takeover because it's politically correct from the US's point of view to call it that. But that's what it is. And I still at this point don't call them a government, they're still a regime, because a government to me is one that can take care of its people to a degree. I know we have critiques of the previous governments, the Ghani government and the Karzai government, and people can make those arguments, and I will make those arguments as well, as they didn't take care of a good portion of their population. But the Taliban are way far behind in that. So I still call them a regime and not a government. And how do you claim the space of human rights or women's rights in this environment? The women are doing it right now with the protests, the attempts to protest. And a really strong women's rights activist, Mahbouba Siraj, actually said it best the other day in a video she sent over on WhatsApp to us, and it went viral as well, is that the women of today are not the same women of 20 years ago. And they have come a long way, and they do have skills, and they are fighting in their own way and to their own abilities. And we can't completely look away from that and say, okay, how do we give in to the Taliban? We are, again, not recognizing the very small steps and the very dangerous steps that a lot of women are taking. Just wearing the scarf, not wearing the burqa in the protests, because they know those are visible, public-facing events. I'm not so, I don't get too preoccupied with the whole veiling issue. I think we have more issues to worry about, and we've talked about that, and that's we've talked about that. But I do think that by just assuming that there is no progress, again, we are overlooking the ways in which Afghan women on the ground are fighting. And so we do need to recognize that. I've been in touch with the women in Herat who actually did the first protest during the Taliban. I was in touch with them. They were calling me from before they actually held their protest. I remember the morning of September 1st, I woke up to a message from the lead protester woman in Herat saying, I'm just telling you, we're planning this protest, it's serious for tomorrow. And if you don't hear from me, then something must have happened to me and I want to say goodbye. She called me, left me a message to say goodbye. This is unbelievable. This is strength. This is resistance. This is going on right now. And I'm in touch with all these women. I know where they are. Some are in hiding because they have to be. They're still organizing. There is still so much activity. It's just, it's covert. It's under, kind of under the radar. It has to be. Otherwise, they won't be able to do it. But we have to recognize that there's a lot going on that is not in media, but give them credit for it. Again, we can't use the victim trope. If you said earlier, what are the assumptions people have made of Afghan women, is that they've always been victims. They haven't. They've fought in their own ways, and we need to recognize and honor those ways.
Safia, if you want to.
Sure, yes. Halima brought up a really good point. Yeah, definitely Afghan women are resisting. They are very resilient. They continue, they fought and they continue to fight on their own way. Definitely Afghan women are not the women of yesterday, women of 20 years ago, where Taliban took over the first time. Again, same as Halima, I'm not calling them a government. They're a regime. They cannot be a government. And I also want to use this opportunity to call on the world to not recognize them as a government, because they are not. So that's very important, because yes, a government should have an elected or at least some system where people are involved. But in like Taliban's cabinet right now, it's pretty much from a very one dominant group, which they're themselves. There is no minority or minoritized groups represented in their cabinet. There is no woman. They removed the Afghan ministry for women and a lot of more that they are doing. So they're not a government, definitely. And they are not representing us. They're not representing Afghans. They cannot. And the international community should not recognize them as a government. The international governments should not recognize them as governments. Definitely, the Afghan women's fights will continue, definitely in Afghanistan, but also outside of Afghanistan. Like we sitting in this panel today with our allies here is one way of fighting. Not only Afghan women are fighting, but others are, at least they're supporting. So I want to thank you all for being there to fight with us, and please continue doing so. So I'm sure that this government will, this whatever they are, this regime, this group will not last more long, because there's a brain drain going. They literally left out half of the population, more than half of the population, which is women. They're left out. They are sent home. They are leaving out the young brains, like our soccer players, our musicians, our like young talents. So good luck with governing a country if you can do it. Like who you will govern with, like with what resources? You don't have it yourself, and you are literally alienating everyone else. Like you're removing everyone else which can support. So they're not a government, and I don't believe they will last long as far as the world do not recognize them and do not support them the way they were cheated to get Afghanistan this time. So
very well said. You're very right. With all the out-migration and then the locking up of women, there is hardly anybody left. What do you think, Aarozo?
The question too, if they are a regime, definitely no. I get sentimental about them, so it might look a little weird, but I don't recognize them as anybody. You know, they are just nobody to me. Maybe this is not a good answer, but that is who they are. And just to add to what Halima said, that women are fighting, one very important thing for now is social media. And this is what makes a big distinction between the Taliban today and then the Taliban 20 years ago, when they were just, you know, they were radios, but they were just Afghans listening to them, and it was all about what the Taliban would tell you. But today, every phone, though, again, they are trying to confiscate a lot of phones, smartphones especially, and then they have publicly announced that women are not allowed to use phones with cameras. That is what they have publicly said. So that is also a point to be noted. Again, there are so many people, youth, women, men, they are resisting to use their phones, and those phones, we all know what is the power of social media, and they are resisting. They are recording their resistance. They are trying to spread the word, be it through Halima's WhatsApp, or I don't know, Safia's messenger or whatever. They are trying to do that. And the resistance has always been there. Like they were being educated in hidden schools, as Safia had experienced. Like her, thousands of girls would go to underground schools during the first time Taliban took over. But now, thanks to social media, the internet, I know it's not very much accessible. Somebody also questioned about it in the chat box. Internet is a big issue, but still with the very limited access people have, they're trying to use it to maximize whatever they can do with it. And one of it is spreading the word about women's resistance. And I think it has always been there. Afghan women have never been passive to any kind of political oppression, and they will not be, especially now that they have more access to social media, and then they have partners outside who would be supporting them. So that is what I think it makes a huge, huge difference.
Thank you so much. You're very right. And I think it, before we open it up to questions, to conclude, and very simplistically to put it, is that maybe we need to engage more with our own governments. And there's enough information out there. There's been information for 40 years on women's lives in Afghanistan. It's nothing new, like Halima said. But maybe women's groups, women's studies programs, universities, academia, policymakers need to now start having talks and discussions, discourses, sessions on what their own governments are doing. I think we need to now internally motivate our government into asking more serious questions rather than giving us, like, I like the term, it's a soft coup, supporting behind our backs the Taliban to come in and then defend them or protect them through language that really means nothing. So maybe, that's a new kind of research we should get into, or engagement basically, is to address our own governments. Thank you so much. Do you have anything more to contribute? I know you would. But we have a few minutes before we open it up to questions and answers. And any last thoughts that you would like to tell the audience?
I think that right now, in the last couple of weeks, and in the couple weeks to a couple months moving ahead, the work that Afghan women are doing on the ground in Afghanistan is going to be very critical for their future. It is right now that they're setting the baseline for what the Taliban will in some ways allow or expect. And so it's very critical that we support in various ways women's movements. I'm talking everything about sending money individually to activists who are in hiding, who've lost all sorts of income in order to be able to keep their work going without these large projects. Again, projects became this really big issue. US funded, foreign funded projects became these really kind of contentious issues in the space of women's rights in the last 20 years. Many of them did a lot of good, but others were just kind of wastes of time. But now we have activists without those networks or webs of support. And so like I send money to individual activists because I know having them apply for funds doesn't work. Just finding very individualized ways of working with Afghan women is essential right now, because they are setting the baseline right now of what will come in the future.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great suggestion. Yeah. Safia or Aarozo, any last thoughts?
Sure. Adding to what Halima said, I would say that solidarity that we keep talking about it is also more important now than ever, to support Afghan women right now, to make sure the narrative is not dying, this conversation is not dying, it continues going around the world right now, and also support the resistance, the women's activism and their fights on the ground and also outside.
Thank you. Aarozo?
I would still emphasize on everybody in the room, and then they have friends to use all of their resources to put political pressure on any institution which you could think would help. That definitely will help, and we have already done some minor work in the United States, and it has already gotten us a lot of the expectations we were looking for, be it benefits for the Afghan parolees who have been evacuated to the United States, or sending some kind of help to some people who are stuck in Afghanistan. So that is very important. Please do not underestimate the power of your voice, which a lot of people take for granted. They're like, okay, we can do things, but it doesn't mean anything. No, it does. Please do so. If you have the platforms, you have access to representatives, your senators, and everybody. And again, talking about Afghan women, I think it's very important that we are aware of what's happening. A lot of people do not really know and do not really pay attention to the issue that Afghanistan is a huge country with a large population of women, and not every woman in the country is miserable. They are not looking for maybe financial support, but they still want to be heard. Their stories have to be shared through different mediums. And this group of people, let's say we are 56 people in the room, if you shared it in 56 places, just imagine if one more person read it, it would be just double. So just share the stories, tell everybody who is around you that Afghan women are fighting. They're not just sitting waiting for you to come and be the savior. They were never expecting, perhaps, and they are not now. You can just Google pictures of Afghan women standing in front of some Talib, person, and you can see how the changes have already, Afghan women have changed already, and how that resistance is continued, and it will continue, and they will never stop. So I'll just end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really enlightening, and I think the main issue that we were trying to get at and achieve is how to have some kind of global engagement. And I think the panel clarified a lot of those issues for some of us. Some questions are rolling in, and do jump in to answer them at your convenience. One of the questions, and I think this was to do with the discussion on education, is what is the internet infrastructure like in Afghanistan, and is it able to support online education? Related to that is, are the universities still open, and how is the enrollment determined? Is it by people in power, who are in also the regime just now, or social class? So it's sort of a three-part question.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead then. Internet is a big issue in the country still, because first of all, electricity is a big issue, and the internet as an infrastructure is still not in place in so many places. In urban areas, it could be used, but then it's very expensive first. Second, it's not accessible by a lot of people. And then finally, people do not have a lot of digital literacy. That is a bitter truth about the general population. But then in the first place, access as of now is very, very limited, because the regime is trying to control platforms, even access to internet. And then electricity in Kabul city, they do not have access to electricity 24/7. So that says a lot about having these electronic devices charged, or even plug in your router. So that is a huge problem. And related to that, the question about universities, that is something to be determined in the future. Some of the institutions are partially opened. I touched on it a little bit. Again, women are not allowed to go to school as yet, and only primary school to 6th grade girls are allowed, but it still is a problem in a lot of places, especially rural areas from where I personally get information and my family lives in. They do not have, Safia mentioned somewhere when we were talking that women are, we have a huge population of female teachers, because they are female and they are teachers, and they have always been there, and now they're not allowed to go to school. So even if these 6th graders were to go to school, they do not have teachers. So the problem is not access to the infrastructure, but also access to the product. So there is perhaps school, but there is no education. So now we have to wait and see what the Taliban, if there is a government, I wish not, but if there is one, how would they determine? That is not there in place. They have said, okay, wait and watch, we will decide something about women. Now that something is very unknown to me. I don't know what's about it, or Halima.
Thank you. Thank you. Safia?
Yes, as Aarozo mentioned, yes, infrastructure is limited, and we don't have enough capacity, but still I would say that every family at least have, or most of the families at least have access to one phone with internet. Mm-hmm. So that accessibility is there, though it is limited. That can still support to be a voice for people in the country and also receiving education. They might not be able to attend online classes live, where it might require like a proper I don't know, large bandwidth of internet, and that would be expensive given what's happening right now and people struggling economically. But they can still access to resources and materials. They can still download those things in their computers. People have computers, at least one in a household, that they can get education. Again, when it comes to schools and universities, yes, women are left out. Some universities and schools are partially open, which is, again, I think I don't want to repeat what Aarozo said. That's what's happening on the ground, and they said that we will get back to you with what will happen with women and going to school. So we are still waiting about that.
Okay, thank you. We are getting a couple of questions about how to help. Basically, one set of questions about where to send money or resources. And I don't know how to work on this, but maybe to the organizers of this session, maybe you guys can send us a list of places or people or contacts and how to do it, which we can send out to the participants. That's something, we can do. There's another question, and a very interesting question is that how can we learn about Afghanistan more? Its culture, its religion, traditions, etc. Because, we are getting such politicized and extreme information all the time. But these are real people who have a history, who have a culture, religion, who have values. And maybe that's something else, if the three of you can put together and send it to us, or put it on just now, if you can think of something, put it on chat. That would be really wonderful. Another question is, and we've addressed some parts of it, but what is the daily lives of women in Afghanistan? And like we pointed out earlier, there's a diversity, but, how are they coping? I mean, life goes on. From all my visits to Afghanistan, I mean, I attended weddings and births and deaths, and, life does go on. But would you say that there's been a dramatic shift since the recent occupation by the Taliban? And, how are they trying to cope?
I think it depends on where women are and what their expectations are of the current period or the future. That indicates how they're doing. I think that the Afghan women in the city centers, in the urban areas, who've been very active. So one woman who I interviewed in Herat said, I would be out of the house from before all of the Taliban takeover, and the Taliban took over Herat a few days before Kabul, and that was early indication. We should have known that. She said, I would be out from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Teaching. She trained midwives, going to civil society meetings, and then, taking care of like my business in the city and coming home. They had what they called a full life. And now she says, I haven't left my home in 2 weeks. So you can see the stark, contrast between what life was like for a woman like that before and after. In the rural areas, probably a little bit of a different story, and maybe daily life hasn't changed all that much, but as far as going out of the home, but futures and expectations and access and worries about food have shifted and changed. So I think when we say how daily life has changed, we have to consider, as we would in this country, variations in class and access to education and work and all of that, and geography.
Thank you. Do either of you want to?
Yeah, just a little addition. Afghanistan is a very diverse country, very diverse. And well, we will not go into the ethnic division of it, but in terms of all the cultural stuff, it's very, very different. So with the regime change, again, those cultures have been sort of differently adapting to it. I come from the northern part of the country, from the very rural part. There, nothing has changed literally. Nothing meaning socially, but then people have lost jobs. That is one of the most important changes in thousands of individuals who are jobless. Let's say thousands of women teachers have gone jobless by now. They do not have any means to accommodate themselves for a day or two. So a lot of so very sad that a lot of people would sleep hungry. That is a fact. Except for that, the Taliban, again, they came, as Halima mentioned, it wasn't a physical battle or something. They just came, and then I kind of feel that they also do not know what to do with the country because they never knew how to rule. They were never rulers, and the same applies now. So they don't know how to deal with the country. And then as they are confused, everybody else is too. And that has impacted the general population. And in Kabul, though, because Kabul is a cosmopolitan city, it's very difficult to control even by the Taliban because of the very diverse culture, urban culture it has maintained for all the years. Now, there are parts of Kabul where people cannot go out of their houses, but then there are parts where people just go party. So that is the difference between the divisions culturally in the country. And then we can maybe, I don't know, talk about, if people were interested, about ethnic lines and ethnic politics some other time. I hope not 20 years later, but that would be interesting to know about Afghans, as we see some people want to learn about the culture.
Thank you.
I think everything was pretty much covered. All I would say is that, yes, because of the diversity, rural and urban lives would be a little bit different, as Halima mentioned. But yes, though a lot of things has changed for people in the urban areas, but in the rural areas, their daily life might not change much, but they lost access to a lot of service. For example, the basic healthcare services, like is difficult for women in the rural areas to access to right now. And I do not want to repeat what my other colleagues said already.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. And I mean, to talk about the ethnic differences, maybe just a little bit, we have a few minutes, is that the Taliban is really Pashtun, and please correct me because I don't want to speak on your behalf, and from southern Afghanistan. And so maybe you can jump in and explain also with the various governments, maybe Halima, that what the intertribal kind of conflicts and solidarities does to the nation and how that in turn impacts women.
Right. And so one ethnic group that I'm very worried about, especially women in that ethnic group, but overall, are the Hazaras. They have, not just under this regime, but under Abdurrahman Khan, our previous leaders, previous kings of the country these groups have been persecuted, forced removal from their homes, brought to different areas. And because of them being Shia Muslims and Taliban being very hardline Sunni Muslims, there's obviously an issue here. So not only is there a historical level of persecution, but then there's this more religious sect issue that has been exasperated in the last 30, 40 years with Salafi and Wahhabi Islam penetrating Afghanistan. So that definitely puts this group at risk. We've already seen attacks. I just got a message from a women's rights activist in Afghanistan. She's worried about a very specific Hazara journalist who was traveling up north. They don't know where she is. They think she was abducted. So these are all happening. They're not being reported, as we've talked about. A lot of these atrocities are not being reported, but they are happening. The Hazaras are being displaced from their homes that they've lived in for hundreds of years or decades or some hundreds of years, like in Daikundi province. This is happening right now. It's not getting the international attention that it needs to get. We can historicize these kind of conflicts and persecutions, but they are actively happening right now.
Safia, Aarozo, would you like to add to?
I think I'm good so far.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Halima covered pretty much the historic background and leading to where we are right now. Yes. Yeah, because there is this sense outside of Afghanistan that there's this Taliban, and they're just evil and Islam, distorting Islam, and making all the women cover themselves up. But the internal struggles have always been there. And I think one should not forget that a lot of the Taliban's verdicts and policies, etc., also are aimed at creating further conflict within Afghanistan. It's not a homogeneous Afghan or generic Afghan organization or political party or whatever they want to call themselves. So.
Omar, just in addition to that, and I think this is a country we've not mentioned throughout the whole session, is the Taliban are for the most part a project of Pakistan, and that has to be said. That has to be said, and that has to be understood, because I was on the border for years from 2004, 5, and 6, traveling down there to Khost and different border provinces, doing reporting and meeting with Taliban who had come over and left, and you can definitely see the effects and the influences and the funding very directly. And for anyone who says we didn't see the resurrection of the Taliban coming, we did. Those of us who were in country, those of us who covered these issues, and a lot of us as international journalists who covered these issues could see it plain as day. And if you travel to the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, you could definitely see the porous nature of it, and the US's double-sided funding. One side sending troops and funding into Afghanistan, the other side being the largest international donor to Pakistan. And that was very hard to kind of reconcile at that point, is the contradiction here of, you were supporting our troops, and every life lost is a huge loss in the United States. But on the other side, the United States is the largest funder of Pakistan foreign aid, and continues to be.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because it's a very sensitive issue to a lot of people in South Asia. But I'm really, really glad you brought it up, because in the US, there's a lot of ignorance behind all of this and all of these issues, and also the nexus of countries that come together to bring about, these kinds of regimes for their own internal interests. It's not just a West versus the East, or Christianity versus Islam, or the various other ways in which we couch basically, international political dishonesty, self-interest, and business interests, And so I think, we need to put together a lot of reading materials. I think in the Western media, we need to, especially in the US, and as all of you have mentioned through various social media, put out a lot of these connections and the larger picture to explain why Afghanistan has become the killing fields of superpowers historically and even currently. And I think it's really important because that's how it's going to play itself out in the future too. So the lack of awareness of these superpowers and their interests in the region can then blind many people from reacting the way that all of us would like them to react. So, I think we have new projects ahead of us.
Can I just add one more thing? All of this is not to take away from a definite responsibility that the Afghan government also needs to take. Yes. For their corruption and inaction. Mm-hmm. This all works together as a complex web. So this is not to take responsibility off that part of it.
Especially what we saw in August with the so-called government that was in place and then flew out of the country. Yeah. So with that being said, cannot thank you all enough for the insightful lessons you're teaching us. And before we leave, I would like to invite Jess Watcott to come up and do the concluding comments.
Thank you. I just want to thank you so much for your time and for the time of everyone who came and participated today. I would encourage everyone who came and watched today to not let this fall away from our attention, especially as the rapid US news cycles kind of capture our attention and we forget about things. But how can we build solidarity into our political agendas, into as feminists, into our classrooms, into our curriculum as educators, and whatever other role we play, but how can we sustain attention and not make this just a one-time event that we attended, but something that we're integrating into our work. And I just wanted to say quickly that the event was recorded today, that it will be posted to the SDSU Women's Studies Department YouTube channel, and a link will be sent to everyone who came today. Feel free to share that link with your friends and networks who could not join us today, and let's continue the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.